Hello and welcome. Today we are diving into a really powerful and, let's be honest, kind of scary idea. What happens when a political movement stops being about politics and starts acting like a religion, demanding total blind faith? Let's get into it.
So let's start with a question that on the surface sounds a little crazy. A political party and a church? I mean, come on. One's about earthly power, laws, and governments. The other is about the divine, right? But what if their basic structures, how they command loyalty, how they explain the world, how they control people, are actually way more similar than we think? That's the big question we're going to unpack today.
And our main guide on this journey is going to be the philosopher Bertrand Russell. Now, back in the 20th century, he saw something really dangerous starting to happen. Political ideologies that demanded the kind of absolute devotion he thought was poison to finding the truth. This quote right here, it perfectly sets the stage for everything we're about to explore.
Okay, so how in the world can you have a religion without a God? It sounds like a total contradiction, right? But thinkers like Russell, they started to see a whole new kind of belief system emerge that did exactly that.
And this is the core idea right here, a secular religion. Think of it like this. It's a political system that does all the same jobs a traditional religion does. It gives you a complete story for how the world works, it hands you a grand purpose in life, a clear set of good versus evil, and it demands your total, unwavering faith. The only thing it's missing? A God.
All right, now let's really get under the hood. Let's break down the anatomy of these systems and see just how deep this comparison really goes.
And I want to be super clear here. This isn't just some loose metaphor we're talking about. The similarities in the actual structure of these movements and organized religions are shockingly precise.
And this is where it gets really chilling. Look at how perfectly everything lines up. You've got sacred texts, right? The Bible, Das Kapital. You have messiah figures, like a Lenin or a Hitler. But the most disturbing parallels for me are these two. The devil, where Satan becomes the bourgeoisie or the Jews, and eschatology, which is just a fancy word for the endgame, humanity's final destiny, while heaven becomes the classless society or the thousand-year Reich. You see, it's the same exact framework, just with different words plugged in.
So how did this all play out in the real world? Let's take a look at our first case study, the dogma that drove Soviet communism.
And this is a really fascinating part of the puzzle. Communism always claimed to be based on hard science and pure reason. They called it scientific socialism. But when you look at how it actually worked, its core ideas, like dialectical materialism, weren't treated like scientific theories at all. They were treated as absolute, infallible truths. It wasn't something you could test or debate. It was a prophecy, a sacred story about where history was inevitably headed.
And you know what happens in any belief system when you question the sacred truth? You get heresy. In Stalin's Soviet Union, disagreeing with the party wasn't just a political argument, it was the spiritual crime, an ideological betrayal. And the tragic irony? Many of the people targeted in the Great Purge were the old Bolsheviks, the original, most passionate believers who were suddenly declared impure.
And here is the unbelievable human cost of that dogma. As many as 1.2 million people executed, not for treason in the way we usually think of it, but for heresy, for simply failing to have the correct faith.
Now let's pivot to our second case study, which in a lot of ways was even more openly religious in its style and substance, the mythology of Nazism.
Yeah, so if communism tried to wear the mask of science, Nazism just went all in on mythology. It was built on this weird, mystical, pseudo-scientific idea of blood and soil. This belief in a sacred, almost spiritual bond between the German people and their land.
This wasn't politics as usual, it was basically theology. The Nuremberg laws weren't just hateful legal documents, they were like religious texts that defined racial purity. They created this sacred in-group, the Aryans, and of course a demonized out-group that had to be purged. And they used these massive, spectacular rituals like the Nuremberg rallies with their cathedrals of light to create this overwhelming emotional group experience that was designed to completely short-circuit rational thought.
And here we are again, with the horrifying result. The Holocaust wasn't just a genocide. In the warped logic of this secular religion, it was a ritual. It was a form of racial purification, a monstrous sacrifice they believed was necessary to reach their version of heaven on earth.
And all of this brings us to the ultimate danger, doesn't it? It brings us to Bertrand Russell's central warning about what happens when this kind of blind faith is allowed to take control.
And this, right here, is the absolute core of the problem. You know, in science, if the facts contradict your theory, you throw out the theory.
But in a political religion, if reality contradicts the dogma, well, then reality gets thrown out. The facts are ignored, and the people who point them out are silenced. It is the absolute death of free inquiry.
So, how did they pull this off? Well, Russell pointed to three main tools. First, you have relentless modern propaganda that just drowns out any critical thinking. Second, you replace a person's individual identity with this powerful group self-esteem, that amazing feeling of belonging to a special, chosen group. And finally, you have good old-fashioned fear and intimidation to crush anyone who dares to step out of line.
Now, it's really important to add a bit of modern context here. Historians today are quick to point out the very different end goals of these two systems. Communism was universalist. Its goal was to eventually include all of humanity. Nazism, on the other hand, was particularist. It was exclusively for one specific race, so very different goals. And yet, even with those differences, Russell's framework for understanding their methods, their total reliance on dogma, on faith, and on the destruction of truth, is still incredibly relevant.
And that leaves us with one last, really crucial question to think about. The specific dogmas of the 20th century might seem like ancient history, but that human tendency, the tendency to cling to absolute faith, even if it means rejecting inconvenient facts, that hasn't gone anywhere. So the question for us is, where might we see that same dynamic, that demand to ignore reality in favor of faith, playing out in the world right now? It's definitely something worth thinking about. Thanks for joining me.